Nature is not, as it were, one object amongst many. In fact, there is no object that corresponds to what it is that nature is.
Receptivity to the all, right, is not a passive thing. It's an active work.
The interesting thing about language here and imagination and poetry is its kind of generative function, isn't it? Poetry doesn't exhaust itself.
So maybe at the end of the day, instead of violations of nature, miracles are ubiquitous.
If I thought there was something that I could only think, it wouldn't be philosophy at all.
Oh dear Diana, tell me why do the things that are beautiful always have a darker side? Oh dear Diana, tell me why is the good never good enough? Underneath the dirt and scar is an old and familiar face.
All right, hi guys, welcome back to The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. Again, I am thrilled to have Iain Hamilton Grant, the illustrious author of Naturphilosophie after Schelling, The Philosophies of Nature after Schelling. I can't believe it. I'm such a dork. In any case, we are continuing our conversation, and this time I have invited my friend and husband and esteemed expert in Schelling as well, author of The Contingency of Necessity. Oh goodness, I'm doing it now twice, now with the person I love the most. In any case, I thought I would pass the baton to him to ask our premier question for today's episode.
Yeah, thanks. So I haven't been a part of these podcasts yet, I guess until today, but I've watched all of them. And so I wanted to ask a quick follow-up question to you, Iain. That namely, you have this idea of Naturphilosophie in both the sense of an objective and a subjective genitive, right? So last time you were talking about that the knowledge of nature is itself a product of nature, right? And that only nature is absolutely a priori, which is to say it's the absolute, right? But why do you prefer the name nature rather than, say, the absolute or being or the one or whatever other names we might give it? Why nominate it thusly?
Okay, so there are many reasons really why, but I suppose the simplest one, and I'll start there, is just the question of what nature does. And it really is a Greek question, I suppose, to me, which is phusis. It's generation. It's ontogeny. It's not an ontology. So nature is not, as it were, one object amongst many. In fact, there is no object that corresponds to what it is that nature is. Because what it is that nature is a contingent state that is constantly being replaced precisely by that function, by the operation of nature, by the operation of birth, if you will. So that's why it's in this sense nature is a priori, not qua object or limited ontic domain, so to speak, not as a limited domain of objects, but rather as the process by means of which everything does come about. And I guess part of me also wants to insist that the same world in which we're considering these questions is precisely the world that actualizes this operation. In other words, there's no distance between, let's say, a philosophical metaphor or a formal language by means of which we might conduct our philosophical activity and, let's say, the worldly state that we are discussing, in which we are discussing, and that is discussing through us. And I think that realization, that move, if you like, to re-involve nature not only in the discussion, but also in the conceptualization of itself, is the reason why I would want to think of Naturphilosophie, or philosophy of nature. Although I don't like that articulation. The philosophy of nature presupposes the philosophy as being primary and the nature as being secondary. That's why I would prefer to use the German term Naturphilosophie, because it places the philosophy as an outcome of the natural process, which is what I think it is. And I'm not really sure there's even space for countermanding that. After all, were it not true, then were it not true that philosophy was an outcome or an issuant of nature, then how would this discussion come to pass? How would it be that philosophy was possible at all? So if you like, it's a response to a transcendental question about conditions, but it refuses, as it were, to limit the sphere of the conditional to subjective ones, nor therefore does it go the other hog and become objective ones. So in a sense, the only parallel there is with the absolute, or certainly as conceived in certain contexts, in certain traditions, if you like, a post-Hegelian tradition, for example, is that just as phusis being conceived as an operation, so too is unthinging, I believe, das Unbedingte, the process by means of which things are removed from the process, the descendental approach through nature, if you will. The unconditioning of things is precisely the means by which a Naturphilosophie undermines, as it were, limited conditionality. So we do have, indeed, unlimited conditions. There are no conditions on conditionality, and that's what makes the conditions so extraordinary. That's what makes it. That's what makes the extraordinariness of making a dot on a piece of paper such a world historical event, if you will. So that's really my reason for pursuing it that way.
If nature or reality or whatever we're going to call the all here, if it's not a domain of objects, it's rather an operation. But it's an operation that produces perhaps various domains and various objects. And so nature in the sense of natality, it's generative or it's birthing, right? It's a naissance. And one of the things that it births, it seems to me, if I'm understanding correctly, is the transcendental itself. So the transcendental is now not like a precondition, but perhaps the highest pinnacle or achievement of nature. And so would you say that this is basically tantamount? It's not Kantian in one sense, but it's not so anti-Kantian that it just gets rid of the transcendental. It seems to relocate where the transcendental is.
Yes, yeah. So there's a line in Deleuze about this, saying the transcendental is the surface of the world and so forth. I don't think that's true. I think the transcendentals are precisely the objects that populate a planet, that populate a world, or that populate all worlds. And what indeed they might be is therefore beyond our ken, a priori. That's an interesting state. I do want to relocate the transcendental. I do not think that, let's say, an ontogeny that begins by eliminating certain kinds of issuant is viable even from the outset. If an ontogeny is to be an ontogeny, then literally whatever is must be an outcome of some process or other. I don't think this is a wild claim. I think that most. I think it's a standard scientific intuition, if you will, that there must be some process that results in whatever issuant there is. And you never, therefore, encounter scientists arguing for elimination. You encounter them splitting their attention between the sciences and, let's say, popular science or pontification about this and that in a public domain. Philosophers, on the other hand, are in love with the idea of elimination. And that's a peculiar thought. What if we turned philosophy on its head in that regard and considered philosophy as being in love with ubiquity and constancy of creation rather than with elimination? And indeed, that reorients the question about elimination to being one that is a question of motive. What is it that philosophy does? Is philosophy the engagement in the limitation of the world, in the reduction of the world to thinkability? That's certainly a theme you can find so redolent in contemporary philosophy, let alone historical philosophy.
Well, Ian, I think this is brilliant because many people, of course, everyone knows to sort of combat reductionism. Reductionism is bad. But that doesn't always follow up with a positive project of, if I put it this way, inflationism, right? Yeah. And I like this way, that if not reductionism, therefore inflationism. So I don't want to dominate the questions here, but I want to come to the imagination, is what you all said last time. And typically, like in Kant, for example, the imagination is a certain faculty that is part of the transcendental constitution. Heidegger makes a big deal that the imagination has to be the sort of schema that ties all of the faculties together. But for you, would the imagination be a faculty at all, or would it be a cosmogenetic operation, or where would we locate the imagination then?
So I love these kinds of questions because the question of location is everything in a sense. There's a sense in which it helps to regard these questions platonically, even through, let's say, a cliched Platonism. So the idea, for example, that entities are instantiated is a good starting point. Then the question of location becomes more problematic, rather than saying it's here or it's there, or it's in some particular spatiotemporal domain, or some particular cognitive domain, or what have you. So I would be reluctant to think of it as a faculty or a Vermögen. Although Vermögen, in Kant's sense, a faculty in Kant's German, may at certain points be more equivalent to the sort of process that happens elsewhere than in minds. So, for example, in the ether deductions in Kant's last works, there's a real attempt to see how the transcendental is mutated by considering it as physically instanced. Yep. So it's not a philosophy of science in the sense he's not taking scientific concepts and saying, let's see how we can incorporate these into our philosophy. He's rather saying, let's take an encounter with the world to furnish some instantiation of a transcendental that will not be subjective, will not be finite in any sense in which I've discussed it previously, but would be open to instantiation otherwise than is currently the case. That's the closest Kant gets to Plato. It's an insight I believe Schopenhauer had, actually, about why Kant and Plato belong together, But Kant doesn't often go that direction. So if imagination is instanced, what allows its identification would be a good question. If it's instantiated rather than located particularly or finally, let's say in one particular domain, what is it that it exemplifies that would allow its identification? Here, I really enjoy what Coleridge enjoyed about Schelling, which is the Einbildungskraft, the Ineinsformung. So the idea of forming into one, or of informing, or of giving form, of making form, of morphogenesis, if you will, to put it in another vocabulary, is precisely what I think imagination might best be considered as. Why? Because it allows then, instead of our thinking about agents having imagination or exercising imagination, it allows us to think of imagination exercising itself in a variety of domains. And so, for example, where there are forms that emerge, then it strikes me that those are equally Ineinsbildungen, so to speak. So formings into one. Of the sort that Schelling hypothesized in his philosophy of art and in his system of transcendental idealism. So there's a fascinating question, therefore, develops about location, that instead of being, as it were, local in one particular or final setup, becomes more distributed. And incidentally, this is something that I think isn't just particular to me. I'm glad to say there was an occasion in which I was asked, "Aren't these just your ideas?" And I thought, no, I'm not at all interested in something I could only think. If I thought there was something that I could only think, it wouldn't be philosophy at all. So the same applies here, I think. The other instances, if you like, we might think of in terms of formation are wherever formation takes place. There's a wonderful book about stones in this regard by Kaiwa. I can't remember its title offhand, but it really is an exploration. You might think of it as lithic art. It might position certain images of stone formations as being artworks, or of being corresponding to artworks in their complexity and richness and so forth. But that's not really the point. The point is the formation that we see some fixed idea of in the stone itself. So the stone not only bears the hallmarks of its history, of its biography and so forth, but it also presents itself to the world. And that sort of forming into one of all these things, of history, biography and presentation, seems to me exactly an example of imagination. And when we happen to consider, or finite rational beings happen to consider these facts, then it stimulates in turn further imagination, lending credence again to the idea that there is a process involved here, that it's not finite and settled in one domain, but rather crosses domains consistently. And this again is about the relocation of the transcendental. not as within a single set of well-defined bounds, but rather as being instantiated by whatever it is that happens to come to be out of the processes that are consistently underway. So yeah, that's where I'd stop.
So this is so fascinating because I can't help but think about the Platonic tradition as well as the ancient tradition in general with regards to the nature of imagination and. The standard tale, most people would say, as a Platonist, or if you look to the Timaeus, it's in the liver, right? Or it's located in the astral body, and it allows us to have this mediating principle. For Plotinus, there's a higher form of imagination and a lower, and the lower is tied to nature, because nature doesn't think the ideal; it just iterates, it just generates, and so on. And so there's it kind of disparagement in the standard interpretation of Platonism of the imagination. But I actually don't think that that's the story actually presented by Plato. For me, I connect fantasia, right, which is on the lowest level of the divided line, but you need all of it, right? Like fantasia is the first gateway drug into your education of the soul, but you never leave it behind. It's the faculty that stays, so to speak, in all different levels, whether it be the receipt, because one of the things that I think is important is fantasia, coming from light, right? It means like this radiation, light, and it's also connected to the Greek word for all of a sudden. So when you talked about the instance or the event and the importance of the all of a sudden, like this epiphany that we have, right? Whether we're coming up with a story or we're understanding a math problem, that it is an event, it is an epiphany, it is yeah, exactly. And so here I want to kind of like get to this idea that the connection between fantasia and inspiration, right? Even your stone example, where you're letting the stone speak, you're seeing it as also participatory in this generative process. There's a relationship, and so one of the reasons why we can't think of fantasia or imagination as a location, but rather as the activity that lights up through a kind of bastard reasoning, that for me, Cora and nature and all of the things that appear, right, this is the generative, like nature is naturing, right? And so as long as we participate in this kind of conversation with that which appears, then we might understand the event or the instance of nature's own imagination and its perfection in that not having the ideal already beforehand, but only in the creative act. And so I hope that isn't too long-winded. And so
No, not at all. The entire idea so starting with Plotinus, weirdly, as I would always like to do because it's such fun. Although there is a lower and a higher, as he says of Heracles, both at once. So Heracles in the underworld, Heracles dining on Olympus. These events are simultaneous. That's the nature of Plotinus dialectic. This is how it functions. And similarly, I think with Plato, so there's fantasia in the context of the divided line, and it's low there, but it's low in comparison with the higher. So each involves the other. So the question arises regarding the identification of fantasia. How does one do this? How is it possible to think what a fantasia is on its own? Answer: there is nothing at all that fantasia is on its own. After katharto, there is only what fantasia is in relation to the other parts of the divided line. So that's one type of answer, but I think really the unity of the two, or rather than so, let's say, well used a term, the combination of the two in particular events is something that is inherently fascinating, I think, to anyone that's ever had an imaginative experience. So start there. Start as an empiricist. So what is an imaginative event? Often It can be sparked by something A, mundane, but B, revealing something that is not mundane in the mundane. So the consistency of the extra-mundane and the mundane, the consistency of the world and the hyper-Uranian topos is absolute in the state of the imagination. This is why I think we have intellectual intuition and such ideas. The influx of ideation in the event of inspiration is unmanageable. It's overwhelming. So the best we can hope to do is to capture some of it and ride the wave. You know, you cannot, as it were, get the whole. If you try and get the whole, you will miss all of it. The inspiration will have left. So I don't think this is rocket science. I think everyone who's ever had an idea will recognize this. You know, so the simple act of trying to surf the inspiration as it arises through this conjunction of the mundane and the extra-mundane, of the cosmos and the particular all at once and so forth, is precisely what I think imagination consists in. But imagination is only occurrent when something issues from it. So there is always, as it were, a comparative dimension to what imagination is. So imagination depends on issuance, I would say. So whether this issuance is mere fantasia, let's say, that's where it begins and ends, and that we have these reflections, these daydreams, this Bachelardian thing, or whether it results in some work or other, or whether it leads us all the way up the ladder, you know, that remains to be seen. But always there will be consequences, there will be issuance of the process that imagination is. In other words, part of what's involved in imagination is the inherent drive to produce, and it's not ours. Again, I think I mentioned this in a previous discussion with you. I was really struck reading The Mirror and the Lamp by M.H. Abrahams, how clearly he got Goethe on imagination, on genius. You know, the Goethean genius is not the sovereign individual. It's not the great man, you know, issuing pontifications. It's rather the clear channel through which so much more flows than is normally the case. So that the overwhelming impression from the genius is that all of nature is suddenly present before us. So this is not holding a mirror up to the world. This is the world coming into being again. And that, surely, is what constitutes both an imaginative event, i.e. the event of our imaginations working, but also an imagination outcome, an issuant of imagination. That is to say, a work that not only is the fruit of it, but also has issuance in turn as its consequent. So I think these two things belong together, and I think the Platonic story really, therefore, only works when, if you like, the two sides, the two poles of the divided line meet. And I think that's really the trick. It's almost a topological question, you know, on what form is the divided line drawn? You know, it matters greatly whether it's a flat sheet of paper or a cylinder, for instance.
Yeah. No, and I mean, even, you know, what Plato did using his imagination to imagine, because it's an analogy for, you know, what is the highest study? It is the good. And then he gives the analogy of the sun, the divided line, and the allegory of the cave as all doing the same work, right? And so you showing in practice, in activity, his own imagination, you know, trying to get at this thing that you can't actually reason or put down precisely, that the imagination is what allows for all three of those analogies to come into being. And this is what I love about what you're saying, is because it shows that receptivity, right, to nature, right, receptivity to the all, right, is not a passive thing. It's an active work, right? That, you know, this receptivity, of this openness to the presence, and being able to see the stone and in its extra mundaneness, that's a kind of activity or work that it's not completely passive. And so this is, for me, important because we tend to think of Kora as the passive receiving vehicle versus no, like this is the very power that if you are open to, right, then you can issuant, you can produce, you can inform, you can create, you cannot help. And so it's as you were saying, it's not the work of the genius who is coming up all on their own by themselves, but no, it is, I guess, an inundation of the manyness of vehicles for stimulating those moments of inspiration that are not yours, but you cannot help but produce because of them. Yeah.
Yeah, can I jump in there? I was thinking there of the wisdom tradition we've discussed sometimes, and an image we've come to, for instance, through Milton when we were talking about his invocation of the Muse in Paradise Lost, and Proverbs and wisdom, the figure of wisdom or Sophia as playing before the face of God in creation. So even we have in that beautiful imagery, that wisdom image of Sophia as having this kind of creative, playful, generative function. And I was thinking a little bit back to some of the things you were saying about languages as well, Ian, here. And of course, when we think of imagination in some sense, particularly when we think about people like Coleridge and Goethe, we're thinking of the poetic imagination or poiesis and these kinds of things. And I was thinking here, of the Bard of Shakespeare, and something like this from Midsummer Night's Dream. The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So, I mean, I'm thinking here of this kind of way in which, the interesting thing about language here and imagination and poetry is its kind of generative function, isn't it? Poetry doesn't exhaust itself. This is something I've said many times, but Owen Barfield, words are only themselves by being more than themselves. Perhaps the same thing is true of human beings. And it's this kind of poiesis, this kind of poetic function. Another thing, the other bridge that language, particularly in nature poetry, you could pick many examples from Coleridge or Wordsworth or such figures. It is fundamentally this polar kind of relation between language and nature, or naturata naturans, as this sort of interpolating set of forces. And here's another example from Shakespeare that maybe demonstrates that. It's the very beginning of the famous speech of John of Gaunt in Richard II. And he says, methinks I am a prophet new inspired, and thus expiring do I foretell. So he's dying. There's this sort of in being inspired, he's also dying, and so there's this sort of play on words and language there, which if we understand inspiration in its proper sense etymologically, it's to inhale the divine breath, as it were, isn't it? It's the sort of pneumatic function of the Spirit or the Holy Spirit, and so. But even in that sort of slipperiness of words and play and image, we grasp both imaginatively and conceptually the immanence and transcendence of nature and language partaking of one another. So I think this is, I guess I'm interested here to think about what the divine role of the poet is in this sense, in terms of generating that function of language or play of language that sort of does that work that you mentioned of sort of edging us forward in some sense, but also returning us and grounding us somehow. But what's interesting as well is that I think this is something that Emerson said, wasn't it? That when you recognize a great thought, it's like you remember something that you'd just forgotten. You realize that it was your own thought as well. And this comes back to your wonderful remarks earlier about, philosophy. If anything, philosophy is worth its salt, then it needs to be a kind of collective endeavor, as it were. So, yeah, I'm interested in that idea. On the one hand, this function of language in poetry has this certain advancement to it, but it's also an act of recollection or a kind of returning, which is clearly a very Platonic idea.
as is the inspiration expiration cycle you beautifully iterated there. I found that fascinating. Actually, I had no idea that. I really didn't have any idea that Shakespeare was so self-evidently a Neoplatonist, but quite clearly he must be. I mean, the inspiration expiration thing embodies a cycle, and on the one hand, life and death. On the other hand, of course, the drawing in of something divine and its exhalation, its expression, its sending back out into the world. It's a phrase that occurs in Schelling. The expressing into nature is a peculiar phrase. What is it that expresses into nature, and what does the receiving end, so to speak, of expression count? How does that count in terms of, let's say, the nature of the expression involved? However, I think the context is simpler almost, or the other context it reminds me of is exactly the context that Diotima advises Socrates of in the Symposium. There's this attention to poiesis that takes place there that exemplifies exactly what I was talking about instantiation. In other words, that poiesis is, of course, instantiated in the arts, in the poet, in the painter, etc., etc. But it's also instantiated wherever there is production. So one of the examples she uses is in reproduction and in birth. There are many ways of exercising poiesis. There are many ways in which poiesis is exercised. And one of those ways is precisely that cosmic cycle of life and breath, which is echoed in or instantiated also in the inhalation of inspiration and its expression into the world. And I find that the world-altering character of the expression of art is no metaphor nor merely hyperbole, but absolutely true in precisely the same sense that the dot on a paper after 14 billion years alters the course of the history that without that dot would be otherwise. So I think there's a fascinating link between poiesis conceived as a non-localizable phenomenon in the manner that Diotima recommends Socrates does, and the function of the poetic expression, which is world-altering. And as I say, I don't think that's hyperbole. The challenge, I think, philosophically, is to think why it would be the case that the world-altering character of an artwork is to be conceived as world-altering at all. And the shorthand alternative is that either that or elimination. And the recommendation, therefore, would be something like an abundance account. Incidentally, this is something I wanted to come back to earlier. One of the people who I've followed quite consistently in thinking about philosophy of nature is another writer on it, an unexpected one perhaps, Paul Feyerabend, who wrote a nature philosophy at the same time as he was writing against method, but it was only published very, very recently. And he starts that with an account of art. And I found that fascinating. Why start a philosophy of nature with an account of art? And there are many occasions in which he reverts to this. So he's chiefly known as an epistemological anarchist, self-styled epistemological anarchist, it's his phrase. But also he is a philosopher of abundance, and his last works were all about that idea. So I think that's the challenge. How do we think of poetry as world-altering? And that's a philosophical problem. That's not hyperbolic claim. It's not a special interest boast. It's actually literally true. The world in which Milton was not is not the same as the world we inhabit.
Yeah, I mean, just in that image of abundance and the poetic image, I was thinking of the end of the phenomenology of spirit. From the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth to him his own infinitude. So, that idea of the sort of overflowing, which of course is Schiller.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what Hegel stole from Schiller is unfathomable, quite literally.
That's another episode.
Yeah, but to go back to this, that part of what we're doing, because you're right about diatoma, or at least I would agree with you, that poiesis. You also see it in the Phaedo too, where Socrates, thinks of music and poetry as the highest, philosophy as the highest form of these things, and the diatoma is also trying to get us to this vision of the beautiful that is part of the wrong, right, of doing philosophy together. But philosophy, as the Timaeus and many other dialogues show, is about also storytelling, right? So that Timaeus has come up with this whole cosmology because Socrates has invited them to return with a feast of words, right? And so builds a story to fit a proto-republic of sorts, to animate it, to make it come alive, basically. And so that, this relationship between, the birthing of creative works, which isn't just poetry of the normal variety, as Diodo would say, but poetry in much the way that I believe we are right now, speaking to each other and trying to imagine different ways that we can kind of connect to this birthing process that, of course, we can't do alone. But also, when you mentioned the birthing example, I thought of, I believe it's Aristotle, who says, maybe it's Galen, I can't remember exactly, but that when you're pregnant, all the things that you imagine are going to affect the child. So that if you start imagining, terrors and all these things, then your child might come out, a tyrant or something like this. And
Malebranche says, with what animal spirits, if you stare at the Madonna too long, then your baby's going to look like the Madonna.
Exactly. And of course, we find this. I mean, I'm laughing, but there is something to it. I think about the different personality I had when I carried my two respective children, and I sometimes wonder if the things I was thinking while they were in utero did, in fact, playfully communicate to these kids. And so, anyways.
Philosophically, of course, that calls for experiment. Yeah. I mean, there is this extraordinary link, I think, once you start thinking of poiesis as having many instances, or as being constituted by more instances than we have yet encountered. Let's put it that way. That's an abundance way of thinking poiesis, if you like, having more instances than we have yet encountered. Yeah. Then all of a sudden, the species of creation of which nature is capable are simultaneously augmented. And that, the imagining of that simple collision of we may not know what the next artwork will look like, we may not know what the next song will sound like, or on which gods it might call. We no longer know what incantation is going to be successful. If we start thinking this way, then all of a sudden we are endowing the world with possibilities that it only has insofar as it is exactly and only the world it is. This is the extraordinary conjunction, if you like, of the mundane, quite literally, the global, the worldly, and the cosmic. That is to say, the larger context that remains inexhaustible to forms of cognition, to any forms of cognition, even the Saturnians, according to Kant. There's one of the things I love about Kant is his early science fiction work, Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, where he hypothesizes that distance from the sun corresponds absolutely to intelligence. There he is sitting in, Königsberg, as far from the sun as it's humanly possible to get. And he's thinking to himself of Saturnians, having great and complex thoughts and ideative processes that we mere Northern Europeans, such as Kant, cannot imagine. I find that tremendous. Yeah.
I really don't want to dominate. Can I?
No, please.
Can I chime in? So I want to ask a question. Actually, it's a bad question that I think I really do know the answer here, right? But I've been surprised before, so maybe you'll surprise me, right? But we have this idea of we've spoken in this episode of Ineinsbildung and isoplasty, and other episodes you talked about the plastic and logic as pattern-based logics and mimesis in nature. And here earlier you made a comment that if creation is creation, then it's necessarily recreation, is basically what I heard. So I want to ask here, laws of nature. right? Law of gravity, second law of thermodynamics, which seems to be rushing us towards our heat, whatever. Laws of nature, are these themselves evolutionary? Are they given, or can in other words, I'll put it like Emile Boutroux on the contingency of the laws of nature. Are they fixed, or can they too change?
So I'll give you the short answer you presumably expect, which is yes. But I think that must be the case. The alternative is that that if you like, Maxwell's demon is realizable, and that the cosmos is a deterministic whole. And that, of course, is a hypothesis that cannot be disproven, but it is nonetheless unlikely. And the majority of approaches to the cosmos suggest that. However, that's all it is. It's unlikely. So one cannot definitively say. However, what would be the case, I think, were the laws of nature just absolute and, once discovered, then unalterable, would be that there would be no conceivable difference between closed systems and open systems in thermodynamics, for instance. Because the laws of nature would be constant and they would count wherever, that would mean what would be the difference between a closed and an open system. So in that case, it would be very, very hard to conceive of life arising, for instance, or of complexity taking place, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, these are just examples from more or less contemporary natural sciences, and it strikes me that the broader question is simply and without supplying an answer, is nature a creative force, or is nature just the satisfaction of some algorithm or other?
So, that's going to be my question. If laws of nature are contingent, does this include a law of entropy? Could that law not merely be retarded, but even reversed, such that more complexity emerges, not in order to speed up entropy, but in fact to reverse it?
Well, if you were to ask that of someone ensconced in a thermodynamically informed environment, they would say, no, the cost would be too high. On the other hand, this presupposes the answer we've already been an answer to the question we've already been addressing. So long as there's, let's say, a species of uncertainty about it, it follows that there can be no definitive answer to the question: are the laws of entropy always going to be are they all, is the second law of thermodynamics, always going to result in the heat death of the universe or not? Can it be countered? There are hypotheses about it. So one can draw attention to examples of people thinking differently about it. So let's say that on certain scales, the second law applies, and other scales it applies differently. So you could at least retard it by reducing scale. This is an hypothesis Stephen Baxter runs with in, I think it's Ring, his novel Ring. And he basically assumes that there is a direct correlation between miniaturization and eternity, which I think is a glorious conceit. But the imaginable, let's say that a cosmos is constantly self-creating, or indeed that there is more than one cosmos, or indeed that the cosmos that we currently inhabit is not the only possible example of one, because there are other examples of which we cannot but dream, let's say, or imagine. Then it follows that the universality of the second law it falls into question again. So there are a great many philosophical reasons to assume that the question is not settled. There's a philosopher, John Leslie, a Canadian philosopher, who wrote a book called Infinite Minds, where he hypothesized precisely a state of this type, namely an infinite number of universes, each of which is mind manifesting in some way, but none of which therefore follows the same, or for that reason rather, follows the same, let's say, pathway, the same history, or the same future. Because on pain of, if that were the case, they would in fact not be many, but just one.
So nothing is a priori excluded. It's a fully empirical question then. But the empirical, of course, obviously, what is it? You cannot attain totality by the empirical road. So the empirical can at best give us tendencies hitherto, something like that.
Yeah, tendencies or unmanifest tendencies, even. So there's a question about the breadth of the empirical hitherto conceived. The British empiricists are not particularly interesting. However, Hume has been systematically misconceived as offering some sort of epistemic reduction, rather than what I think he is, which is a transcendental philosophical anthropologist. He is not interested in matters that can be demonstrated mathematically. He makes that quite clear. He is much more interested in what can be done with the basic equipment of the human frame, such that we can come to not merely some species of knowledge about that frame, but actually exercise it better or find other things to do with it, and so on and so forth. You can see that even in his autobiography, or in his dialogues on natural religion. They demonstrate, if you like, precisely the plasticity of the account of human nature with which he's happy to work, and therefore the contingency of it. He's not interested in law-bound character. There's something of this, I think, survives in even the uniformity of nature question. So looked at skeptically, as it's usually been looked at, it's a skeptical epistemological question, i.e., if what guarantees that the nature we inherit tomorrow will be in any way resembling the nature that we have lived through today? The answer is nothing at all. However, what this licenses is equally the idea that where there is continuity, it can only be explained as a miracle. So there's an extraordinary dovetailing of the various parts of his philosophy, which makes him a systematic philosophical anthropologist, if you like, rather than an epistemic empiricist, which is how he's been misconceived. And therefore, I think there's more to empiricism than has been satisfactorily demonstrated thus far. I think, therefore, metaphysical empiricism, I mean, at first glance, an oxymoron. What would such a thing be? And Schelling's is the name Schelling gives to a species of work he does at some point. It remains to be imagined, remains to be thought, and remains to be practiced. And that, indeed, is something I'm interested in pursuing.
I had this strange thought because because I'm thinking, the nature of, what Hume is doing, trying to, imagine, disrupt, so to speak, our kind of cause-effect understanding, all these things so that we can start imagining differently, start having different stories about the nature of cause or miracles or whatever it may be. And it reminded me of Aristotle for a second, where Aristotle says, and this might be a segue to my husband's own research currently, so sorry, where Aristotle says you can't, give a rock the habit to roll upwards, right? No matter how much you try to get it, it's never going to change its ways. And then I was like, oh wait, no. Like, human beings aren't supposed to fly, but the Wright brothers started to imagine, right, because of this impossibility, that all these impossibilities, the rock can't roll upwards. Well, I'll come up with a machine that will help it make it possible, or I can come up with a story where rocks do, in fact, roll upwards and downwards and they're alive, right? And so it is the imagination, right, that, in fact, allows for the possibility of what seems to be fixed and determined to turn in a different direction or change its shape or to give birth to new informed ideas or stories. And so I just wondered what you guys would think of this, particularly because you're working on habit ontology. And so,
Well, I mean, you mentioned, Hume here, Ian, which I like. I mean, one of my pastimes recently has been trying to out-Humean Hume, which is to say, so you say, well, on the one hand, he seems to say epistemologically that we shouldn't believe in miracles because the evidence will never be on their side. So what we need are continuities, but the emergence of a continuity is itself miraculous, which means we have to fall back on it. So maybe at the end of the day, instead of violations of nature, miracles are ubiquitous. But by Hume's own principles, we would have to say something like that.
Yeah, so this is a rational theory of miracle. Yeah, absolutely. And then you look at Goodman's new problem of induction and parse the same thing that way, or parse the same problem through his mechanisms, and you get a very similar outcome. Hence, it is art that is a world maker for Goodman. And although he's hesitant on that, he's too much the nominalist to make the substantive claim, nevertheless, I think it's there. Yeah. Okay, so yes, absolutely. And equally, the Aristotle point is apposite. I also remember Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics saying that a stone cannot be educated, which suggests that he'd tried, which is, I'd love to do that, although I think, thinking back on some parts of my career, I may have done. There is an extraordinary idea of involving. There's an extraordinary idea of the plasticity of a stone, if you like. If you can even imagine the prospect that a stone it can have its behavior changed, it can learn new behaviors, in other words. And even though its learning might be slow and it may have less of a contribution to its own learning than we might imagine the case in finite rational beings, for instance, it nevertheless follows that it acquires new habits and thus, one could say, learns by means of a technology. And a technology, a lever, a pulley, any kind of machine we might imagine, of course, only works in consonance with the same nature as the stone is. So in other words, this example of the educating of a stone is precisely something that nature does continuously. It's conceived, however, as if there is a single agent who possesses imagination, who is responsible for manufacturing, for creating, first of all, imagining, then manufacturing the machine that proves the triumph of one part of nature over other parts of nature. The same phenomena can be recast as nature learning new habits, new behaviors. And that seems to me to be nearer the mark. Both, it makes, it's a Platonic rejoinder to the ineducability of the stone that Aristotle concludes is, a fact about the world. But insofar as the possibility of learning is something that is instantiated differently depending on what context we discover it in, or depending on what context it is manifest in, I would prefer to say. And two, that the very world that previously had ascribed to the stone a certain limited choreography, if you will, is now forced to revise its views on the choreography of stones based on machineries that are part of that world as a result of other beings that world has furnished us with. So there's an extraordinary recapturing, if you like, of phenomena that belong to agency by phenomena that are simple operations that transform, I think, how we think of the world, such that each new behavior of a stone constitutes a new dimension in the if you like, the topology of lithic mobility that constitutes a planet. Yeah. So
No, 100%, because we also think about, like, this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, that we think about Michelangelo and how he said that, he doesn't treat the stone, right, or marble as if it's an entity all by itself, right? Like that rather it's asking to be carved, right, in some such way that it lends itself to the tools, and you have to have the kind of understanding of what tools are appropriate, so that when you're a painter, to use X brush or Y brush or X mineral to make a particular hue or color, right? And so again, the thingness, right, or the oneness of the stone, where it's a subject or an object, no, it's in this relation. It's whispering, hey, there's a face in me, carve it out. But also, I was thinking not just the machinery, right, but to go back to Gareth's idea about memory, that nature learns from herself, right? Like, so you think about the stone, it receives the raindrop and it comes over and over and over again to the point where you stand before the Grand Canyon and you realize nature has carved the impossible, right? Because it is retaining the memory of each instance, and so learning to no longer just be this round stone, but to be these strange crevice-like veined things because of nature herself, learning from herself or remembering herself and creating the impossible, but also, as Hume would say, absolutely connected. There's the miracle. Is I stand before the Grand Canyon. And I'm like, well, wow, that should not be. That's impossible. But thank goodness for nature's memory that she retained it. And so,
yeah, absolutely. There's an extraordinary thought about that nature does this to itself. So the raindrops falling on the stone are precisely parts of nature communicating, one might say, or natural history consists in the development of an event, such as tiny, almost impalpable drops of matter, can alter what took billions of years to form. And moreover, these facts and acts can be witnessed by other parts of the same nature that produced this minor miracle. It reminds me of, so there's the anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard wrote about animism in his introduction to anthropology, and he uses the following example to really, I think, to break us out of, let's say, imaginative prisons such that we might inhabit if we're monocultural. And his claim is this. He says that to an animist, the world is so designed that this man is crushed by this buffalo at precisely this moment. To the Oxford-educated anthropologist, the question becomes, how do we re-engineer things such that the world will no longer visit upon human beings the terrible mishap of encountering a bison or a buffalo in an open field? You know, however, both of them are thinking the same thing, namely the agency of nature is such as to produce precisely this minuscule accident, just like the drops of water on a crevice of rock being witnessed by an imaginatively inspired individual. So too, the agency belonging to the scientist, let's say, is capable of altering the entire course of that nature. So they're really thinking about miracles on different scales and practiced by different things. However, what they have in common is a terrible tendency to think like Aristotle in terms there must be some possessor. There must be something that possesses these characters, that possesses these behaviours, that owns this agency, that is a master of that imagination, if you will. And that is where, again, I think the instantiation of things and the restoration of the bizarre elements that the world-altering trajectory of a raindrop can have on a planet comes to the fore and exemplifies a naturalistic Platonism.
So I asked a bad question earlier because I already knew the answer. Yes, of course, laws of nature can change, do change. Let me ask a better question now because I don't know the answer, right? And this idea of, on the one hand, we seem to have this idea that nature is nothing but an operation or a series of operations. But on the other hand, you brought up here, well, for Aristotle, must there be some substance that does the operation or a possessor? And for me, this question often occurs in what's the relationship between operativity on the one hand and the elemental on the other. And I think in all three of the conversations you all have had, the name for the elemental here becomes something like plasticity. Maybe Oken calls it Urschleim, Pers, protoplasm. Merleau-Ponty calls it the flesh of the world, whatever, right? And so my question is, what is the relationship between the elemental, whatever name we want to give to it, the plastic, if you will, and operativity? Is one of them primitive, or do we, are they both already there? Or this is a real question for me. How should I think this relationship?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. This is the heart of the problem, I think. So there are operations. Need there be? No. And if there need not be, what states might there also be? And why? So the answer to the why question, I think, is a good starting point, which is unconditioning. And I think the best example I can think of for this, again, comes from Plotinus. And I had this in front of me because I've been thinking about it for since actually we last spoke, because I mentioned it then. I wanted to go back to precise form of words. So this is McKenna's translation of Aeneid 189. How can we identify what has never had any touch of form? We utterly eliminate every kind of form, and the object in which there is none whatever we call matter. If we are to see matter, we must so completely abolish form that as to take shapelessness into our very selves. And that taking of shapelessness into our very self strikes me as exactly what the epistemic practice of unconditioning, of unthinking looks like. You know, it's a really good empirical description of what happens there. If operations, in other words, are not primitive, how did it come to be that there was something where hitherto there was not? Not why is there something rather than nothing, but how did it come to be that there is something? We start from the fact of the world, if you like, not from an hypothesis about a world that is merely possible. We start from the fact. How did it come to be that our world came to be? Was the world always there? Best of our knowledge, not. Therefore, it came to be. Was the cosmos that supports the world always there? Best of our knowledge, not. Therefore, how did it come to be? And there are various possible answers about it. However, all of them must have this in common, that the state from which operations derived cannot itself be an operation, except insofar as once it has taken place and an operation arises, then the prior state will become an operation by virtue of the later outcome. And it strikes me that that's the only way it's possible to think this. But it does mean that we have to accept, let's say, a heterogeneity of elements entailed by the fact of something existing that did not. Whatever that is. Something or some state comes to pass. The coming to pass is the central fact. How does that happen? It was not, now it is. So that transition is what requires to be thought. So that's really the simplest way I think about it, but it's so unsatisfactory to me, largely because it doesn't account for operation per se. What does account for operation is the mere fact that the world came to be and was not. The mere fact that nature is an historical process, in other words, that we cannot obviate by mere theory, demonstrates that operation comes to be prior following the world's existence. So following the birth of a universe, operation comes to be prior by virtue of the fact that it was not there.
Yeah, I mean, if I can recapitulate, I hear you say something like that fundamentally there are no differences in kind, only in degree, if we want to call this univocity or monism or whatever. However, since it's always a qualitative change of one state to the other, this does not spell homogeneity. It rather spells heterogeneity, so that we have something like univocity or monism in order to save the differences rather than to get rid of them.
So the summative identity of the universe would be one is many, one could say.
One is many.
On the other hand, I would rather say, rather than fundamentally, I would rather draw attention to the requirement that there be consequence in order that some state, some elemental state or some unthinged or some formlessness have obtained. The consequent is what makes the antecedent the antecedent. The consequent does, if you like, all the work. An operation that had no outcome would not be an operation.
Which means that even time is not a container, but generated. Because antecedents and posteriority are themselves both generations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there are various surprising sources in which you find this thought. I mean, one of the things that always struck, in fact, the thing that got me into as an MA student translating Lyotard's Économie libidinale was the opening chapter, the great ephemeral film, La Grande Pellicule éphémère. This extraordinary claim. What is this? On the one hand, everyone points out, oh, this comes directly from Merleau-Ponty. On the other hand, it's ephemeral. It's an ephemeral film. It's not something that fills space and time. It's not fundamental. It's rather an event-based ontology of space-time production. And that's exactly what he goes on to say in 1979, in the Conditions postmodernes. So his more popular works, or the works that are being read more, say the same thing. They're working with a similar ontogeny, I would want to claim, namely that space and time are local phenomena, following on from what it is that's produced as having those attributes. And that's a peculiar way round. That basically says the substance is the very last thing, not the very first. Or the essence is the very last thing, not the very first. And once the essence is last, it necessarily becomes another. So it isn't final. There's no finality to this. There's always only transition, or abundance, if you will.
Does this lack of finality
in
Lyceia also imply a kind of anti-Aristotelianism on this regard?
Interestingly, yeah, it wasn't where I started with that, but I realized that later. Yeah, I mean, actually, I was thinking about this in Hegel. You know, how can you ally a dialectic, which is supposedly an evolution, a logical evolution, with a teleology, which of course he does. You know, this is why the phenomenology starts with a feast that turns out to be spirit eating nothing but itself. So yeah, it does entail, however, I think the anti-finality. So a philosophy of metamorphosis without finality,
Yeah, good.
and that I think is what the world embodies. Hence, therefore, the world thinks this way. Hence, Naturphilosophie.
I have many more questions, but I want to give Gareth a chance to ask some questions if he feels like it.
I'm quite enjoying listening to this dialogue, actually. No, I mean, I was thinking, as I often do, of where this comes back to poetry, and I was thinking of a passage from Blake's poem on Milton. Allow me just to read this. The nature of infinity is this, that everything has its own vortex, and when once a traveller through eternity has passed that vortex, he perceives it roll backward behind his path into a globe itself enfolding like a sun, or like a moon, or like a universe of starry majesty, while he keeps onwards in his wondrous journey on the earth, or like a human form, a friend with whom he lived benevolent. So I was just sort of drawn here to this idea of, well, something we haven't really spoken about, and I don't know if this will take us too far off of the topic, but we've mentioned the symposium, we've talked about Diotima, and I was thinking here of the relationship of imagination to love, and Eros as also being this important part of its generative function. I mean, we began with the idea of natality, I suppose, so it does bring us back in some regard to where we began. But here, this idea of benevolence is important. And of course, we can draw lots of connections there with the Christian theology, for instance. But also with ideas we've spoken of about the kind of overpouring or overflowing nature. And something else I've been reading recently is the 14th century anchorite, Julian of Norwich, who wrote Revelations of Divine Love, in which she describes a series of showings, which are called showings or kind of visions, which were she had on a deathbed, as it were. But there's this incredible sequence of imagery where she's effectively given her last rites and is held before her face as a cross. And then this whole series of visions unfolds. But there's this really wonderful passage where she describes this particular vision. And she says, and he showed me a little thing, the size of a hazelnut on the palm of my hand, round like a ball. I looked at it thoughtfully and wondered, what is this? And the answer came, it is all that is made. So there's, the idea of the world in a grain of sand, or the poetic image as being the kind of generative image, and a kind of benevolent or loving image, seems to me of some significance and poetic import here.
So you just reminded me of the power of artists to create worlds, right? With their poetry, or with, like, think of Jules Verne, or you think of Lucian and going to the moon, like that we imagine the impossible, but that implants that seed of like, and then nature, and because it's as if nature wants to give us our wildest dreams, right? Because we so dared to dream. There seems to be that kind of playful, like, parental childlike relationship, but also a lover, right? Like, but also, the roles end up reversing in many ways when we, take the stone and we turn it into something else. And so, yeah, I would agree that that this relationship that occurs with imagination also is a productive thing because of a kind of, like, sometimes we tend to think of the world as awful and bad and sufferable, but like we also have histories of like so many impossible things happening that show this beautiful relationship, that if we just take our vantage point and look at all of this productive capacity, it is destructive too. But yeah, at the end of the day, we create worlds, and it's a beautiful thing, and it happens again and again and again. And so, anyways, thank you for that, Gareth.
Yeah, I think there's a significance there as well, isn't there, to this kind of almost itinerancy, our sense of as being kind of journeymen or travelers, as it were, which the sort of topos, if you like, of the poetic imagination, or this sort of sense of place that I think, interestingly, we're kind of grappling with as well, in a sense, or location. And this is, of course, frequently the nature of that poetic imagery. I mean, another example, something I've been thinking a lot about recently for various reasons, is the Divine Comedy. And of course, here, the whole journey, and I've just read recently Charles Williams' wonderful book, The Figure of Beatrice, which is his kind of exposition of the Divine Comedy and what he calls the way of the affirmation of images. And it's about this sort of tension, in a way, between our rejection or affirmation of the image and its truth, or what it points to, or in fact the truth of how it points beyond itself, in a kind of poetic excess. But fundamentally, his journey from the dark depths of the woods in which he begins, into the descent of hell, up the Mount of Purgatory to the Garden of Eden, and then when he's met with Beatrice on her ceremonial chariot, and departs with Virgil. So there's kind of interesting things going on here in terms of his journey with the poet, to find the face of the beloved. But it's interesting that in all of that kind of poetic production, and this maybe comes back to some of the things we've spoken about thematically, we're left with this kind of excess, this sort of ultimate overflowing. The final canto of Paradiso is, that incredible passage of the love that moves the sun and the other stars, and the sheer inexpressibility of the vision. And incidentally, I think this is an interesting side of Hegel's philosophy, and Donald Vereen's written a very interesting book on this, in terms of the function of images, and almost this kind of image relationship between concept and image as enfolding and unfolding one another phenomenologically. But this is, in a sense, partly what we see in the poetic journey of a figure like Dante, is how image leads to this, the excess of the image becomes embodied in the poetic word, which then points to the image. And so there's this kind of generative back and forth of the two. And he says rather beautifully in Canto 30, so this is where now he has almost reached the end of the journey. He's been traveling with Beatrice now, and it's through the recognition of her face, or by looking at her face, that he's then able to see the face of the Mother of God, and then this then enables his vision to become even higher. So it's this act of recognition. We've talked about receptivity, but it's his act of looking towards the countenance of the divine image that is seeking the face, that is what compels him to journey further. But then he says, in a sense, in a summary of the whole journey, from the first day I saw her face in this life, until this sight, the pursuit in my song has not been cut off. but now must my pursuit cease from following longer after her beauty in my verse, as with every artist at his limit. So, there's this moment where the word is not enough. But then we're led on through the image to more words. So this cycle continues. So I hope I haven't taken us on too great a detour there, but I think that thematically these things are connected with a number of the topics we've covered, albeit my longing to bring them back to poetry.
Which is hugely appreciated. So there are two things three actually. First, the hazelnut-sized object that contains all of creation and so forth. An interesting abundance-based response from Schelling. Everything is primal germ, or nothing is. So not just this is all of creation, but so is that, and everything else. And by the way, anything you make is also all of creation. And by the way, anything that anyone else, blah blah blah. So you're faced then with an excrescent cycle of production, an excrescent poiesis, which is exactly the sort of direction that diotima takes love in and from. So we never refine eros in diotima's license. We never refine eros into a mere search for the good, as it were. Eros remains eros, i.e. massively promiscuous and unapologetic and always climbing, always ascending. So this brought me to a question. I got to Dante from Diotima, and I thought that was interesting. There's a parallelism there. All the commentators say Dante is basically an Aristotelian in his cosmology. I'm not sure. I'm not sure at all. I think there are Platonic elements there that are really important. And if that's the case, then the constancy of change, both of medium and anagogue, throughout the Divine Comedy is massively significant. Of course they're going to change. And it's kind of pinioned around his ascent of the devil in Dis. So they climb down, down, down. They're going down the creature, and then all of a sudden they're going down his legs and emerge upright rather, in purgatory. That fascinating twist, as it were, has to do with precisely the kind of, that's the nutshell, if you like, I think, of the Divine Comedy that contains, as it were, this switch between, as it were, the metric of love based on unity and the metric of love based on abundance. But I think you're absolutely right. I think in drawing attention to the connection between not love and strife, as it were, as Empedocles would have it, but love and quantity, which I think is the operative problem. Utterly fascinating. But there was something else, but it's momentarily escaped me somehow. I have no idea. But I relish these opportunity to talk more about Dante, actually.
Well, how about next time we do that and make it explicit?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
That'll be fun. All right. Gareth, would you like to wrap things up for us, or?
More poetry is what I hear you asking there.
If you have one up your sleeve.
Okay, well, fortunately, here's one I prepared earlier. I'll finish with Dante again then, shall I? Okay, here we go. And maybe this is interesting because this might set us up on an interesting cliffhanger, as it were, for where we take this, because this is partly about how we direct the poetic gaze, or what that function is, and the point of, I spoke here about looking, but of when we sort of must look away, perhaps, or something like this. So he says, so this is Canto 28, Paradiso. I turned at the loving voice of my comfort, and what I saw then of love in the holy eyes I leave here untold. As I gazed at her, my heart was freed from every other desire, so long as the eternal joy that shone direct on Beatrice satisfied me from the fair eyes with its second aspect. Overcoming me with the light of a smile, she said to me, "Turn and listen, for not only in my eyes is paradise."
No, and that connects to Goethe and Helen, right? And even the importance of the present moment, and only the present moment is our happiness, right? Right? Thinking of the event, right? Like this nature overflowing, you're looking at her, and then you overflow, but it all happens in the presence of the now, or the light, or the revelation of the present moment that, for Proclus can be tied to the past and also stretches infinitely towards the future. And so the kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, just thank you
Yeah,
for that.
and absolutely, yeah, and it reminds me of some conversations we've had about the symposium as well, and the sense in which the form of love is sort of, or the universality of love is instantiated in the particularity of the beloved, as it were, and that sort of relation between the infinite capacity of love to be instantiated within the love of someone, as it were, never to be exhausted in that relation. But I think it's interesting here that this is to do with how we use imagination as well, isn't it? And what that role of imagination is in both love, but also in the very nature of this poem, which is to point us towards it. They look at it, but then look away.
Well, thank you guys again. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Iain. Thank you, Gareth, for a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure.
Oh dear diorama,